So, Asha, is Jim Jordan's weaponization committee a problem for the FBI?
It's complicated. I'm Asha Rangappa. I teach national security law at Yale University. I'm a former FBI special agent, and I'm a legal and national security analyst.
And I'm Renato Mariotti. I'm a former federal prosecutor, a practicing lawyer, and a legal analyst.
And we're here to help you understand topics that can't be boiled down to a soundbite or a tweet. So, where do we start?
Well, one thing let's start with, because I think it's really interesting, and I think we're going to have different perspectives on it, is this Washington Post story about disagreements between the DOJ and the FBI. I mean, it's very, very rare that such disagreements are public. In other words, just so people understand, when you are conducting a criminal investigation, DOJ prosecutors kind of lead investigations. At least that's the DOJ perspective, that we lead investigations and direct FBI agents, and there's often disagreements between us. I had more disagreements at the DEA, but there's disagreements often with the FBI. But those would get resolved internally. You rarely see news articles about it. And this suggests to me that there's some pretty disgruntled people, probably at the FBI, who were talking to reporters about it.
Yes. So, and I think what was unusual is that the disagreements between the DOJ and FBI were kind of flipped. In other words, normally it seems like the FBI wants to be more aggressive and it's DOJ that's putting on the brakes. And what the reporting suggested was that at least some officials in the FBI and agents were pushing back against taking aggressive steps against Donald Trump, specifically in terms of investigating him, even for the Mar-a-Lago documents, not even January 6th, the Mar-a-Lago documents, which are kind of straightforward and for which there is ample precedent on how people in similar situations have been treated. And it gets to, I think, a larger issue related to January 6th, which I wrote about in a piece for Just Security, about some concerning things that have emerged in terms of the reluctance to investigate Trump for January 6th. And, a lot of tips that were ignored, and then even in the aftermath, certain types of slow walking and resistance, which, by the way, was echoed by a report issued internally by the Office of Inspector General on the FBI's response to January 6th. So all of this is painting a picture of at least some subset of the FBI either sympathizing or having support for Trump and or January 6th, or at the very least being afraid of pursuing investigations because of possible retaliation against them. And we can talk about how that connects to Jim Jordan's subcommittee in a second, but I'll pause right there.
Yeah, I do think there's a connection, but this is I think there's an interesting connection between these two, and we can talk more about that. But I think just as a starting point, I did find one thing I found very disturbing about that article was the fact that folks at the FBI agents and people who are supervisors there were focused on and concerned about public blowback from the Trump camp, from Trump and his allies against them. And it really suggests to me that the sort of disinformation campaign against Comey, Strzok, Page, all of those McCabe, thank you, worked, and it really got the FBI to pull its punches against Trump. It's very concerning to me because, look, I was a federal prosecutor for a long time. Now I'm on the other side. The FBI is usually not pulling punches. And like you suggested, usually, when I was a federal prosecutor, I was the one trying to explain to agents, like, no, we can't do this, we can't do that. Actually, it's a lot harder to make our case than you think. And no, it's not, we can't just wrap it up now, and there's a lot more to do. Usually I was was like the whatever, the one who was providing caution. That was usually, like you suggested earlier, Asha, the role of the prosecutor there. I'm not used to the FBI being the one like too concerned and worried about going in. And I don't think it's ever appropriate for prosecutors to consider criticism, to consider and by the way, I say prosecutors, the FBI as well. Law enforcement should not be concerned about, well, how are we going to look in the media? I mean, frankly, that was the Comey problem that got the FBI in a lot of trouble in the first place. But that's really problematic because it means if you're rich, if you're powerful, if you have a lot of influence, you can get away with things that other people can't. I mean, it's just really, it's almost corrupt.
Yeah, and it does seem like the concerns that were expressed and resistance that was expressed by these agents and senior officials impacted how that investigation proceeded. That sort of so prosecutors wanted to execute a search warrant initially, and as a result of this resistance to doing that, they sort of settled on this interim measure of issuing a subpoena for the documents to be turned over, which kind of goes to how the Department of Justice went above and beyond to try to accommodate and be as non-intrusive as possible for Trump. It also suggests that had Trump just turned over everything at that time, this would all be over right now. And what was amazing, the second amazing thing was after that subpoena was executed, I guess, or, after they got whatever documents initially back, there were some agents that were like, okay, case closed. We believe him. We think that he gave, and this is someone who has lied over 30,000 times in 4 years. I mean, in the FBI, we call that a clue. That maybe, you don't want to take everything at face value. I mean, these are people who are trained in detecting deception, and they were willing to just accept assurances that that was all he had, and wanted to close the case, which was astonishing to me.
Yeah, I have to say it's just so incongruent with the way that they usually operate. And I'll say this, when you're on the other side of it, it can be very frustrating. You have a client who you think is innocent, or you represent a witness you think is telling the truth, and they're so convinced that she's lying, and it's like, come on, And here, every reason to be concerned, suspicious about this, and the FBI wants to pull their punches. I will say a lot of when I tweeted about this, a lot of the comments from my followers were like, hey, Christopher Wray is ruining the FBI and all the FBI agents are in the pocket of Trump. I think those are overstated. I'm curious what your thoughts are because you're you're an FBI alum and a lot closer to it to me. But I do think that there are some agents, and of course, we had certain agents that may have been leaking to Rudy Giuliani before the 2016 election, for example. I do think that there is definitely agents are mostly Republican and they always have been, and so I do think there's some element of that, but I think it's a little overstated.
Yeah, I don't think Christopher Wray is in the pocket of Trump. I think Christopher Wray may be kind of reacting to a more acute degree to the same things that Comey was. Remember the whole leak, Trumplandia leakers and this idea that there was going to be a mutiny if he didn't reopen the investigation into Hillary Clinton? There is definitely some subset that are full on, Trumplandia. And I think that Christopher Wray has been overly, I don't know, hesitant, cautious. Like, he has not been aggressive after January 6th. I think partly because he's afraid of part of the workforce that he thinks are going to, I don't know what he thinks they're going to do, which, connects to some of the stuff that's happening with Jim Jordan's committee. But, let's remember that after January 6th, Christopher Wray didn't even show up for the press conference.
Yeah.
About it 2 days later or whatever it was, 2 or 3 days later. I mean, I remember at the time being very shocked about that because, if it were a major foreign terrorist attack, Or frankly, if it had been a domestic terrorist attack that was not, a bunch of white people wearing MAGA hats, I believe that he would have been there making a very strong and forceful statement. So we see this sort of definitely, I think, a form of catering to this political subset, both in the public and I think in the workforce. I would probably not go so far as to say that he's, you know, in Trump's pocket in the same way that some of it, like that Bill Barr or,
Cash Patel or something. Yeah.
Grinnell or, all these other people were.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, like I said, I think it's really overstated. I think people leap to conclusions, and I can understand that people are frustrated. But yeah, I actually think the way you're describing it is sort of the way that a lot of people have talked about Garland, right? There's been a lot of people saying, look, Garland
Yes.
is concerned about politicization, so he just wants to stay away from anything that relates to politics. And I think, you could argue the same is true of Ray. You mentioned Jim Jordan's committee. Obviously, we want to talk about that. I want to ask you about that. And I think, what's interesting and ironic, right? And that's the reason that I think it was good to start with the Washington Post piece is, while the underlying reporting suggests that, if anything, the FBI is pulling punches to help Trump, the disinformation campaign coming out of Fox News and Jim Jordan, who I just kind of regard him and some of those folks as essentially an arm of Fox News or in league with them. There's this disinformation campaign to suggest that the FBI is actually, trying to frame Trump or trying to work against MAGA or whatever.
Right. And so this gets to the weaponization, the select subcommittee on the weaponization of the federal government, which is a subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee headed by Jim Jordan. And he has for months been intimating that he just has a league of whistleblowers waiting in the wings to come and just blow the lid off of rampant FBI abuse. And he's likened his committee to the Church Committee, which was a storied congressional committee from 1975, headed by Frank Church. There was also it was a senator, and then there was also a House committee called the Pike Committee that investigated intelligence abuses by the FBI, CIA, NSA, and led to many of the major reforms that we have in place now, as well as the oversight committees for the House and Senate intelligence committees. So it turns out, to the extent that we were talking about this subset, this sort of extreme MAGA subset that maybe in the FBI, they are manifesting for sure in these so-called whistleblowers who have, been fired or suspended basically for refusing to do their jobs. It seems to me, as far as I can tell, for when it comes to investigating January 6th. And so far, Jordan has not produced these witnesses publicly, but at least 3 of them have been interviewed by Democrats on the committee. And the Democrats released a 316-page report outlining what their preliminary findings are on these witnesses, which is that they, don't meet the definition of whistleblower, which is a legal definition where you have to expose actual misconduct or violations of the law, and then you get certain protections under the law. But that often they don't even have firsthand knowledge of the things that they're alleging. They traffic in conspiracy theories, including COVID conspiracy theories. And one of them was even giving interviews to Russian state propaganda outlets while he was an FBI employee, to Russia Today and Sputnik. So the whole thing is sketchy, and P.S., they're all funded by one Cash Patel, who not only gave them cash money, but also is paying for their lawyers and even helped one of them find employment at a conservative, I wouldn't call it a think tank, but some sort of conservative organization that's run by Mark Meadows. So the whole thing is really, really sketchy.
Yeah. So just speaking, as somebody who I've represented whistleblowers, that is what a whistleblower is somebody, like you said, knows about a violation of law or policy or something along those lines, and usually very bravely brings that to the attention of authorities and gets protections as a result, because that person has to be concerned about retaliation. At least that's how it is often in the government context. Sometimes, of course, there are whistleblowers in other contexts, like in private companies, where they'll go forward to the SEC. You'll hear about whistleblower awards and things like that. That's a little different. But in this context, it's all about, is the government breaking the law? Is the government violating its own policies? Like you said, I mean, that's not what we are seeing here. I really view these folks a lot like I view the Weaponization Committee as sort of a way of serving up clips for Fox News to try to lend some meat in the bones to conspiracy theories. I mean, from what little I've watched of the Weaponization Committee, I watched it a couple different times. It just seemed like kind of a panoply of conspiracy theories, Fox News conspiracy theories. And, something about living in that world and being part of that ecosystem is that if you have even like a little shred of something that you can hang your hat on, it sounds like there's some weight to it. Like, well, I heard there's an FBI agent saying there's a lot of problems there at the FBI, or, well, in Congress, they're investigating this. And it lends a weight to what otherwise would be. I mean, they still are conspiracy theories, but nonetheless, I think it can give supporters some confidence or feeling that there's something more to it.
Yeah, I call it information laundering.
Information laundering. Wow.
Yes. So you take the conspiracy theory and then you essentially launder it through some sort of legitimate process, or you allow it to be aired through something that has credibility. And then that sort of lends it the legitimacy. And that's exactly what you're talking about. We've seen it before in the lead up to the first impeachment. There was a lot of information laundering happening by the likes of Ron Johnson, that was, trying to bring into the record these, Burisma, Hunter Biden, all that stuff that that Trump was trying to get Zelensky to investigate Biden for. They were trying to make that into a thing. It reminds me of Mean Girls. Like, stop trying to make fetch happen. They were trying to make fetch happen. And I think that is what Jim Jordan is trying to do. I think, to your point, what one of the problems is that these conspiracy theories are coherent and make a lot of sense if you live in that bubble, because you hear it all the time. And you have all these tidbits that are like mashed together, and you're hearing it repetitively. And to the people that you're in communication with, everybody knows all of these details that all fit together. The pedophile ring that Trump is taking down, or whatever you want to call it. But once it gets exposed into real life, they fall apart. And I think we've seen that happen with the Twitter files hearings, where it turns out that the only people who were pressuring Twitter was the Trump administration. And I think that this is what's going to happen with Jim Jordan's committee. It's just not going to hold up to the light of day.
Well, one thing that I always say as a trial lawyer, if I had to say like my secret sauce, is that usually the simple story beats the complex story. So usually I try to make my story, my themes, everything that I'm doing to a jury simpler than the other side. Even if my story is more complicated, I find a way to make it simpler. And I think one thing that makes those conspiracy theories so appealing to people is they often are a very simple story. Like, Trump's always being investigated for things all the time, and he's always running into legal trouble. And so it's like, well, they're all after him, right? It's like a very simple explanation. It's not like, well, actually, he seems to do all of these really bad things all the time, which obviously would kind of contradict their prior assumptions and their biases. But also, it's easier for someone to believe like, oh, they must be after him, right? And it sort of fits into, kind of prejudices that people have. And I think, what this does is it tries to lend enough credibility to that to make it plausible. So very unfortunate, but something that I think is here to stay in the consequence of the last election. It's a consequence of losing the House.
Yeah, and I would encourage people to read the Democrat staff report on these witnesses. Even just there's a 5-page executive summary at the beginning, because what they're doing, I think, is essentially what we need to do with disinformation, which is to pre-bunk narratives. So there's always first mover advantage to getting out information. And so what Democrats are doing is basically saying, like, here are some facts you need to know about these so-called whistleblowers. And the more that people are educated on that, and the more that gets circulated and highlighted, the less traction that Jim Jordan's, selective framing, or however he's going to present it, is going to work.
MSW Media.